If you've been to writing classes or were lucky enough in high school to have a good English teacher, there's a good chance one of the first bits of writing advice you received was show, don't tell. The second bit of writing advice you'll probably receive is to take your ADHD medication. No, seriously, grab some water and take it. It's time. But I digress. But now you're probably wondering, how does one do that in writing? Film is simple, right? You see a character who has a handgun on a strap, and later in the film, even if they're wearing a jacket, if you see a sudden, sharp hand motion towards the holster, you're being shown that they're reaching for their gun. The scene wouldn't be quite as impactful if she shouted, "I am reaching for my gun," as she does the motion.
I am a surgeon!
In a similar way in writing, you could establish the gun when describing the character and write something to the effect of, her body went rigid, sweat dripping from her brow as she scanned the room. She reached into her jacket, put her hand on her holster. In this little passage, we can infer that she's tense and stressed in this room and that it's time to pull out the gun we may have established in an earlier description. Why I'm bringing up two written and visual examples of show, don't tell is to point out that What Remains of Edith Finch does both to great effect, and sometimes doing both simultaneously. It's a game I've been wanting to play for a long time, and just under 8 years later, I finally got around to playing it. I've never played a walking sim before, and I think this was a fantastic introduction to the genre. What I found was a story that was enriching for me, a great cautionary tale about the power of stories and the impact of generational trauma, while being presented in this beautiful art style with moments that are truly haunting. There's a melancholic solitude as you walk through your abandoned family home, learning the story of every Finch. The story is beautifully presented and to my knowledge has very few, if any, mistakes, but we'll go through that and you can make up your own mind. The game clocks in at roughly 2 to 3 hours of playtime, so if you don't want spoilers, here's my glowing recommendation. It's fantastic. Go play it and come back, because now we're going to be diving into the story. The first thing to realize about the Finches is that they are extremely brazen to the point of reckless negligence. But they're also pioneers, crafters, creative and imaginative, extraordinarily talented in ways that lead to arrogance or depression. We explore what being a Finch came to mean, and from the earliest point of the game, we learn that the Finch's misfortune has been attributed to a curse, a supernatural element that leads them to their deaths. But what I will mention is I don't think this is what's going on here, even though on first playthrough I thought this might have been the case. As we go through each story, I think you'll see what I mean. The reason we find out about all these stories and misfortunes is from Edith Sr., who is named Edie to avoid confusion between her and the perspective character, Edith, Dawn's daughter. Just making sure to clarify that to avoid spreading misinformation. Edie has so many qualities that make her tragic, but also pitiful in how she revels in keeping the story of the curse alive in so many ways. One of the main ways being how each room was vacated and made into a shrine for each Finch's death.
As a kid, I just assumed every house had peepholes and sealed rooms you weren't allowed inside of.
And another small detail in her room, even the bird cages from her deceased birds are put up as a display with pictures. We will be discussing Edie as we go through this, but for now, keep in mind that Edie is obsessed with the family name and the rumored curse in a ghoulish and unhealthy way. The story is cut up into several different gameplay events as we play each Finch on the day of their death. Even the perspective character, as we go through the house, a story is being told via Edith's journal to her son. These stories are told by reading various diaries, a comic, psychiatric letters, sincere letters of comfort to a loved one, art books and pictures. Each Finch has a character aspect which relates to how their death was documented. A lot of love has gone into giving each Finch a fully realized character that you can find out more about, both from environmental storytelling and what flavor of memoir they left behind talking about their death. We break into Edie's room through the window, and the aforementioned bird cages are the first thing we see. The second thing I noticed was an unfinished painting of Lewis, and we will be talking about Lewis later. The second thing my eyes were drawn to was the Viewmaster. The Viewmaster flips through images which explain the rather insane method in which the first Finches to inhabit this plot of land tried to avoid the curse. They settled on the Ben Shapiro method, which is sell your house and move away. Except now I'm realizing that that joke doesn't work because they took their whole fucking house with them on the ocean. This is our second glimpse into the Finch's staggering recklessness, yet marvelous ambition and passion. The first being the house, which seems to be a colossal mess, which kept being added to, with the top structures looking like they could fall at any moment. The commitment to architecture and craft was evident to me, as well as the devout insanity needed to view these additions as safe for the children, which ties into another story we'll talk about later. There are various tabloid headlines and pictures in Edie's room, with a notable comment from our perspective character Edith on the mole man in the basement, which is a wild thing to say, and Dawn not being happy with that makes a massive amount of sense given the context that we learn later. The other tabloid talking about how Edie refused to leave her home during a wildfire, and also Druid World. Anyway, we learn in the story of Sven here, who Edie would fabricate the story of, saying he was killed by a dragon, when in fact he was killed by the dragon slide that he was building.
When Edie told people Sven was killed by a dragon, she could also have said he was building a dragon-shaped slide that collapsed.
Edie seems obsessed with perpetuating the mysteries of the Finch name and household. She has a callous disregard for her own safety. Her belief in the fates and the curse leads to her appearing more youthful than even her own relatives.
In her 90s. Sometimes Edie seemed a lot younger than my mother.
Entering Molly's room is somewhat equally magical as it is convoluted. This family really loves using books to make secret passages, but as Edith points out, she'd only seen the rooms through the peepholes, so there was something mystical about it, like stepping into a painting. Molly's room has masks of various animals, entomological kits and bugs, and posters preluding to deep-sea creatures. This ties into what has to be the most fantastical way of telling a story of someone's death. Molly went to bed starving and started eating things that one could loosely consider food, minus the toothpaste. The first thing she bloody eats is a rotting carrot from a gerbil's cage. It looks like the gerbil may also have passed away. I'm surprised there's no picture of it. If you try to open the door, we get the first voice line spoken by Edie.
Mom, can I come out now?
Sweetheart, it's late. Go to sleep.
Sending a child to bed hungry is a severe sign of negligence. Using sustenance that is needed to survive as a privilege has huge ramifications for how a child may view the world. A video for another time? Sure. This decision has massive consequences, involving Molly eating mistletoe, which is known to be poisonous. Though deaths are unlikely, but I think that the mixture of that and the toothpaste was the deadly combination.
I thought about eating Christopher, but I held back.
The next scene suggests she's going to eat a bird she sees at the window. When she opens the window, one may be led to believe this is how she died, falling to her death. In one of the most breathtaking scenes from the game, she morphs into a cat, subverting expectations like this with the jarring first-person view and stunning visuals, makes this an introduction to the almost magical side of this game. It really stands out and is one of my favorite moments in the game. I've never played a game which was bold enough to make you play as a cat in first person, with carefully crafted detail to how a cat would walk and jump across trees. Dishonored did give you the ability to possess other animals and humans, but they always felt like you were playing the same character and were just kind of gliding and a little smaller. You go from cat to owl to shark. The shark beginning is hilarious.
cliff and into the...
It's fantastic. And then to an unspecified deep-sea monster, eating bigger and bigger meals consecutively on the way in gruesome detail that genuinely made me uncomfortable. The monster goes about on a fishing ship eating sailors when suddenly the monster smells something extra delicious. The twist being that we end up back in Molly's room. As the monster, we hide under the bed and cut back to Molly, who is surprisingly content with her death.
I held my breath for a long time, but I couldn't hear anything. I think it's waiting for me to fall asleep. But it's not going to wait much longer. It needs to feed, and we both know I will be delicious.
This apathy towards death is very much ingrained in the Finches, with Edith thinking about how Edie probably believed the monster story, whereas what I interpreted as the actual cause of death being poisoning and hallucinations in the last moments before death. The idea of a monster or monsters carrying out the curse will come up again later, and has its own small subplot throughout these stories. Something I also want to mention right now is that in order to access these rooms that have been sealed up, we're using
Secret tunnel! Secret tunnel!
that just go through the house. The Finches that built this place flexing their eccentricities. But notably, if you look down, you can't see your feet unless you're walking. You have a bit of a belly. My first impression of this is that Edith was pregnant. So I'm bringing this up now because as we go through the story, I had this fact in the back of my mind, while Edith behaves rather recklessly for someone in her condition. And all through my first playthrough, I found myself constantly anxious about what she was doing. Calvin and Sam's room is the next room we enter, with the horrifying realization that Sam stayed in this room for 7 years before signing up to the military after his brother's death. I had imagined sleeping in a room opposite the ghostly shrine dedicated to your brother would cause a wild amount of psychological trauma, and I understand wanting to get away from the house, another running theme we'll see more of later. Sam had written an essay on how he wanted his brother to be remembered, and that takes us to our second story. You control Calvin on a swing. Oh boy, I can see where this is going. One of the first things I noticed is that Calvin is wearing a cast on his leg. The Finches get injured a lot. This scene is wonderfully anxiety-inducing. It reminds me of a ride at a theme park close to where I used to stay, the Congo Queen. There's the sense of weightlessness as you swing higher and higher, to the point that falling can feel both liberating and terrifying. The game captures that experience perfectly. The sense of weightlessness is palpable, and as you go higher and higher, we're once again reminded of the recklessness of the Finches that have a swing that could easily fling a child into cliff faces below or even into the broken picket fence. There's a certain negligence to how the children in this game are raised, an issue that culminates into one of the most harrowing scenes of the game. The outcome of Calvin's death is obvious given the setup, but the execution is flawless and the creative use of text once again adding to the storytelling. We close on Sam lamenting how his brother wanted to fly and that day he did. The devastation this must have had on Sam, who spent his life coping by hardening himself to survive. We'll discuss that more when we get to his story. Through another contraption hidden on the bookshelf in their room, we get to access another secret tunnel and a shortcut to the main house. But we must press on towards Barbara Finch, child star. Barbara was a fascinating case study on the horrors of being a child star. So many child stars end up becoming dysfunctional as adults from the pressure they received as a child. But now they're older and not cute anymore. They head into adult stardom where critics are not as kind as they used to be. The industry is more cutthroat, and adults don't offer them the same kindness or allowances. As you get older, your voice changes, your body changes, how people see you changes. So while in childhood you may have had a vocal talent, now you're older, that's gone. While you can still learn to sing, or in Barbara's case, scream well again, it won't ever be the same. Age and maturity come with benefits and costs. I'm sure every adult can relate to these struggles. My voice changed in high school, and that affected my ability to sing. I couldn't hit notes that were easy for me before. It's hard to relearn these things. In some cases, when it comes to physical skills, eventually age catches up with all of us. A pro sportsman in their 40s will never have the same peak skills they did as a 20-year-old. Time comes for us all, and no one really teaches people how to deal with that. In Barbara's case, she couldn't let it go. So many child stars feel washed up at 16, which is horrible. You've got your whole life ahead of you, girl. We learn about Barbara's story through a wonderfully presented, horror-themed comic book, with some moments where we take control of the panels. It tells the story about how her boyfriend at the time tried to be her vocal coach, as well when, to be blunt, he had no fucking clue what he was doing. Her dreams were crushed. She wouldn't be going to the monster movie fan event to do her famous scream. Her father sawed through his hand while woodworking, and someone has to keep an eye on Walter. Her boyfriend attempts to scare her into screaming by hiding in the fridge, located in the rooms in the workshop basement of the house. If you look around the room, you can see wooden effigies of Calvin and Molly, elements in the sculptures relating to their deaths. The boyfriend fails to squeeze a scream out of Barbara, and for this rather dreadful attempt to scare her into a scream, she kicks him out, which is the first place which I think the story diverts from what actually happened. Walter screams and Barbara reluctantly goes to check on him. She doesn't find him, but does get attacked by a hooked man that has been mentioned on the news radio. Barbara does her best Corvo impression by
Secret Tunnel!
into Molly's room, which is a nice bit of continuity because us, the players, can say, hey, I do that. Barbara manages to knock the assailant off the top floor. You walk past this guardrail earlier on, and you can see that it's been shoddily repaired, which I believe was on purpose so people could morbidly recount the tale of Barbara's struggle. The ending has Barbara going down the stairs to be greeted by multiple people that turn into monsters. Much like Molly, the comic portrays Barbara as accepting of her death, if even not gleeful about it, as she gives her best performance. All we find of her is her ear, and her boyfriend was never found. Walter was under the bed the entire time. Alright, so this is pretty cut and dry for me. There was a killer on the loose described in a monstrous way, and Walter interpreted the struggle that happened between Barbara and her boyfriend as a monster killing her. He hid the body and ran away. Or the ear thing was entirely made up and they just buried her. The way I see it, it was a clear-cut murder in cold blood because of a disagreement. This retelling to the writers of the comic could only have been done by someone who knew the house well, because a key detail is if you keep winding the music box, a key to the basement pops out, which is how we get to the next story. It is my perspective that Edie told them an elaborate story of a grandiose death. At this point, you may be noticing a trend of people dying and Edith perpetuating the mystery of the curse. This is one of the most damning pieces of information I have on how much she traumatized her own family repeatedly, building creepy shrines in their old rooms and turning the whole house into a museum. It should also be noted that these rooms used to be open, but Dawn closed them off. Edie retaliated by adding peepholes, which just gave the house an even more creepy vibe than it already had. New rooms being built onto the house instead of repurposing them. Edie's obsession with making her family mysterious, cursed, and prolific leads to generational trauma with no sign of stopping. I think this can be seen most with the next Finch we will talk about, Walter. After finding the key and going into the basement, we find a tunnel behind the whole fridge. A generator whirs to life, giving some light as we go deep into the foundation of the house, where Walter, the man Edie lied about and called the Mole Man, lived here after his sister died to what is perceived to be a monster in his eyes. A monster which not only killed Barbara, but also killed Molly and Calvin. Walter lived down here for 30 years. We don't see much about his life other than the routine he built, even welcoming the sound of the monster that would rattle his shelter at 12 p.m. every day. Eating peaches and the water inside it, which made me gag. It looks entirely unappetizing. One day, The rumbling stops. The routine he's gotten used to has changed, but something inside him has changed too. He goes down even lower into his bunker. The books on the shelves talking about removing curses, the history of the Finches and common monsters. He's spent 30 years obsessed with staying alive and hiding down here. He's bold enough to go outside for the first time, but something extremely telling is he doesn't climb out of the bunker. He'd rather take a sledgehammer to the wall and escape that way. I think he's afraid of the house. He's afraid of the story. It's generational trauma. The music of this section as he sees the sun for probably the first time in 30 years, minus the painting outside a installed window in his bunker. He laments that he doesn't care how much longer he lasts. Unfortunately for him, that's not very long.
I can already imagine the sun on my face.
Walter dies, killed by a train. Edith notes that Walter was down here while she was still alive and she never knew. This family's dysfunction runs deep. Edie reveling in the idea of telling the tabloids about a mole man that lived under the house. It was Walter. What a dehumanizing way to describe one of your own family members. Edith goes out the same hole Walter made. The tracks are old. We get to walk this beautiful beachfront during the night. Edith talks about all the stories and how maybe letting them die would save the family. But even her mother, Dawn, wanted her to know these stories, to know what happened, to know why everything happened the way it did. Going through the graveyard, we're reminded that the graveyard was built before the house. All the gravestones are customized to represent each child and how they died. Something I glossed over is that Edith painted a portrait of each Finch, which can be found in their rooms or their shrines. The calm night, the music, the use of creative text, everything here is hauntingly beautiful. I can't emphasize more how many little details there are. And now we climb a tree and balance across a branch, with Edith mentioning at this point she's 22 weeks pregnant. This is a very rewarding confirmation of a speculation you may have had earlier on. You could criticize that the game spells everything out for you that you may have picked up from environmental storytelling. But two things make this brilliant to me. The first being that if you're reading a mystery novel or watching a mystery show, a good one anyway, all the clues that will allow you to put the pieces together as it goes on, and the payoff is it telling you that you were correct or why you were wrong. You're being shown so that it is rewarding to be told. Secondly, this is in a journal given to her kid, which is easy to forget with how seamlessly the game tells this story. Edith's journey through her house feels like it's happening in the moment, happening right now. We finally get to Sam's story, and now we can talk about how much he's tried to create a persona that cannot be hurt, a person who survives. He hunts. He goes into the wilderness. He prepares his child by teaching her how to use a gun. Even his photography, some of it on the cover of magazines, glorifies the soldier lifestyle. Fighting, surviving, tough. Naturally, the story is told from the perspective of photographs, Dawn mentioning that he doesn't know how to relax, which is poignant because we've also seen Dawn being mentioned as seeming older than Edie. She has that same intensity due to her father raising her to always be in survival mode. This was his method of coping with everything that happened to the family, and Dawn echoes this. But that will be his downfall, setting up the camera while his daughter weeps over the deer her dad made her shoot, ignoring his daughter and putting the trust in himself, assuming the deer was dead, only to fall to his death, the calm music playing in the background as the camera photographs his death. He tried to live to outlast the death that runs in his family, and his toughness killed him and left his daughter without a father. Okay, the next story deals with Gregory, who is a 1-year-old baby. If you would like to skip this, I'll be putting timestamps on the video, but just be warned, the next story is potentially extremely triggering. The 2 times I knew something horrible was coming up was when I saw the plaque of Gregory showing his birth and death dates to be a year apart. The painting of a happy baby portrait, which some found to be a little scary, but all I could feel was sad. I almost wanted to stop playing there and then because the game had been scarily brutal in showing the moments of someone's death. We start Gregory's story as a note written at the end of divorce papers. Gregory's perspective in a bathtub with a shallow amount of water. And the first thing that struck me immediately is that you do not, under any circumstances, leave a baby in water in a bathtub unattended. This is the single greatest act of negligence in the whole story. The Nutcracker suite plays as we gleefully play with the toys in the bathtub. There's a serious juxtaposition from what we know is about to happen versus the visuals of the toys dancing around the bathwater. There's a moment where you're slightly misled because Kay pulls the plug out of the bath. She doesn't notice that the plug pops back into the drain as she continues her argument with Sam over the phone, their relationship clearly crumbling. We see text rotating around the tap to turn the water, and reluctantly we know what happens. A toy thrown at the tap causes the water to flow until the bathtub is full, and suddenly Gregory is a green frog swimming towards the light as the toys dance around him. Sam says about Gregory that he always seemed happy, and he would have loved to see what he sees, and much to the despair of the player, we do. I don't know what more to say about this. Other than Sam's comforts that it wasn't Kay's fault, I vehemently disagree. This wasn't a curse. This was negligence. This was a parent focusing on fighting with their spouse instead of watching the baby in the bathtub. This isn't Sam's fault, even though he probably blames himself. The story is starting to put itself together. The amazing visuals and mystical moments may have you confused, but when it's boiled down to it, all of these deaths were avoidable. These were the misfortunate events of a group of people traumatized about their history. To Edith's surprise, she finds a poem written by Dawn about Gus. This echoes how Sam wrote a letter on how he'd like to remember Calvin. A little bit of like father, like daughter moment. Edith's perception of Dawn was not that of a poet. We'll speak more about Dawn in a moment, but I'd like to talk about Gus briefly. The visuals of him flying a kite, being a usual teenager, even throwing a middle finger at his dad for marrying another woman. Sam follows the same pattern of apathy. There's a storm outside. The kid needs to come inside, even if he didn't want to. That's the right thing to do. The poem is beautiful. You fly a kite through the scrambled letters to reveal the next verse, and has a childlike rhyming structure, except for the last line.
I wish that I could truly say I thought about you on that day. Out there on the beach alone, just you, the wind, the sea and foam. But I didn't, until we found you.
I don't have a wealth of perspectives on Gus's death specifically. I find it pretty cut and dry compared to most of the other stories. Gus's story is still tragic and beautifully executed. Not every death needs to be grandiose. And to be honest, this sounds a little silly and weird. Slightly less intense deaths after Gregory is well needed. Going through Dawn's old room reveals how she dove into religion after Gus disappeared as a means of coping. We can also see in the schoolroom that she reveled in the scientific method as a way to avoid falling into Edie's trap about talking about curses constantly. We can also see evidence of her trying to accurately portray history to the class. Dawn went from using religion to cope to coping with structure, science, and facts. I'd argue that's more healthy, but I'm reminded of Hill House, where character Steve is so convinced and obsessed with explaining everything in his life through facts and logic that he gets a vasectomy and ruins his relationship by being obsessed with not wanting to spread his perceived idea of mental illness while profiting from the suffering of his family. Oh, what's this picture of Edie doing here? Dawn moves back into the house after her husband Sanjay's death, and everything was good for a while until the involvement of Edie, who built Milton a castle. Throughout the story, you can find art done by Milton, and he's seen as one of the more talented artists in his family. Milton doesn't die, so to speak, and in fact is transported into the world where he becomes the lonely king in The Unfinished Swan, which I didn't grasp on first playthrough, and it's a little bit left field, but a nod towards other projects that they've worked on is totally fine. He left a flipbook of an animation of him walking through a door, which he titled The Magic Paintbrush. But my interpretation of this is that he committed pseudocide. He ran away. And honestly, I think this all comes back to Edie. His dad died, and now Edie kept reminding him of the horrible deaths in the family. The house was a museum of death, All he wanted to do was create art. So he just left. I would too. In fact, I tried to run away similarly due to my living situation being horrifying in its own unique way. But it turns out running away successfully as a kid is really hard. He has a tombstone, but I think at this point we can just assume Edie wants to add another death to her memorial collection. Whew, that's a lot to digest, right? Surely the game can't top what's already happened. Well, allow me to ruin this video's runtime even more than I already have. Let's talk about Lewis. Lewis, Milton, and Edith were very, very close. We can see this represented in the memories of both of them being fondly remembered by Edith. With this in mind, let's unpack Lewis, the big brother, and also stoner. To be honest, smoking weed and playing video games isn't a bad way to spend your early 20s, and many do. So the comment Edith makes about his room having a distinctive smell may refer to that, as well as him just being a messy young man. But Edith loved him and remembers playing games with him fondly. He is described as being a kind young man, and what happened to him in his life must have left him shattered. Milton goes missing. Edie adds another name to her collection of stories, and Dawn is distraught. His little brother is gone and he didn't do anything. His habitual drug usage becomes problematic. He doesn't have much to live for, but he tries to get better. He starts working at the fishery, becomes a model employee, but doing a monotonous job is soul-destroying, not just for a Finch, but for any creative. I have worked in customer service and had to deal with monotonous data capturing. And I was good at them, but I struggled emotionally. In fact, it drove me to drink more than I was comfortable with just to survive 11-hour shifts of listening to people being rude to you for no reason while you tried to help them. Lewis had an idea, the start of one. What if he imagined himself doing creative, explorative things? This has to be one of the best moments in the game for me. You're controlling Lewis's character going through a small maze while performing the monotonous job of cutting off fish heads. There is an addictive method to the routine of fish chopping while playing through Lewis's imagination and mind wandering. It was really rough hearing the psychiatrist say he made a friend, and it was the dog in his imagination. I don't know, that hurt. He must have felt so lonely. The psychiatrist's letter we're reading is very careful not to confuse Lewis's imagination as psychosis, but as it goes on and on, it becomes apparent that this game is symbolizing a detachment from reality. Now, as someone who knows a little bit about psychosis, I would like to jump in and say that this is an accurate rendition of how these sorts of things can happen. Psychosis needn't be linked to schizophrenia or drugs. It's possible the psychoactive elements of weed smoking may still have been in his system, but I'm going to go out on a limb here with my own perspective. This is not a representation of psychosis. In fact, I have had daydreams like this while doing monotonous tasks or while falling asleep, imagining a better, more hopeful world for myself, where I was a main character in some sense. A world where I was my ideal self, perfect, just the way I want to be in reality. The things that tick the boxes for me is this grandiose sense of self, being the king in his imagination. He's spreading his empire. He's meeting a handsome princess or a beautiful prince, the partner of his dreams. There's monsters, but he can beat them. He can be anything here. There's a rather jarring juxtaposition as he goes through a door, where I actually encountered my one and only experience of a glitch in this game. It was pretty funny. But when he enters this door, he's slammed back into reality for a moment, perceiving himself outside of himself, dissociation. This culminates in him believing this world he created for himself is the real him. There's no more fish needing to be cut. He climbs up the conveyor belt into his world completely. The repetitive chopping wasn't just to symbolize monotony, it was also to show you exactly what will happen next when he's crowned.
Bend down his head. I think you know.
Lewis's story is a masterpiece, a really well executed gameplay loop with hints and story elements that loop into each other, creating a melancholic but satisfying conclusion. Finally, we climb up into Edith's room, where she sits down and writes about what we're reading right now. It's time for the final story, the last night at the house. Edie is suggesting a toast for all their nights that they'll spend apart, with Dawn lecturing her about how she shouldn't mix her medications with alcohol, another example of the apathetic nature all the Finches share. Even their matriarch, that's lived through all of it, could have died at any moment. Dawn is the voice of reason, opposing Edie's beliefs and exaggerated stories of all the deaths that have happened at this horrible death museum of a house. It's finally time to come to a conclusion about Edie, which I believe can be summed up with one thing: the already almost completed picture of Lewis for his room. Lewis had not been dead for that long, and she was already eager to add him to the history of the family. I believe that Edie is unintentionally malicious, but that doesn't excuse it. She enforces generational trauma, rumors, and tabloid articles that maintain her investment in the curse that haunts the family. This curse isn't some magical thing. It's the trauma she keeps alive by turning rooms into shrines of the deceased. It's scary, sinister, and chilling. No matter how well-meaning, if she had learned to move on, so could everyone else.
Edith has a right to know these stories. My children are dead because of your stories.
The generational trauma of the Finches leads to callousness, apathy, and blatant disregard for their or others' safety. Edie is abusive. She cultivated a space in which her own family felt that they could die at any time due to the curse. There was no reason for any of them to take any precautions. Instead of addressing the core issues and learning, they continue to perpetuate their negligence from generation till generation, till there's just one, maybe two, left. Edie dies in her home on the day Edith and Dawn left. Dawn dies at a surprisingly young age, 48, from an undisclosed illness. Maybe she started to believe it. I certainly don't. But she gave the key to Edith to start her journey through the house. I'm sure Edie would have eagerly started painting her portrait before she took her last breath. We then experience a birthing scene from the perspective of a baby being born.
Supposed to be for you. But now I hope you'll never see it. I just want to meet you and tell you all these stories myself. But I guess if you're reading this now, things didn't work out that way.
This is the only character we play that doesn't die. Sadly, Edith died in childbirth, given the dialogue. The book closes. Edith's son has a cast on his arm, echoing Calvin's cast on his leg. This may be an indication of the same disregard the rest of the family has. He places lilies on her grave, and we pan up to one last shot of the house before we end the game. So, what is Edith Finch trying to say? For me, it is a cautionary tale of misinformation and the obsession with leaving your mark. And in the case of this family's mark, on the world. If you constantly chase the unachievable goal of being immortalized by everything surrounding you and everything you are, you stop living. You stop being alive. You start only caring about the next story you can tell people. Edith writes a rather poignant passage.
I'm worried the stories themselves might be the problem. Maybe we believed so much in a family curse, we made it real. I don't know if I should even be writing this.
I think that sums it up. Don't be apathetic. Don't let a legacy stand over you. Just exist. Just create. Be sincere. Being here. Being present. I think the ending of the game is bittersweet. There's this feeling that you've learnt the history of a tragic family with their matriarch that by any means necessary wants to maintain their legacy. And what did that lead to? There's only one Finch left. That's what remains of Edith Finch.
Oh, that's why they call it that.
Thank you for watching.
Hello, hi. I'm on my floor because my back hurts after editing the video. Yeah, so thank you for watching. It was really fun to make this. I've got more ideas, but I stream on Twitch, so you should check out my Twitch if we're playing cool games, Twitch. Please tell me whether you liked the video or not. I was very inspired when I played the game. And there's some other cool content creators that talked about it as well. And I really wanted to take my own take on it. So yeah, if you enjoyed, there's gonna be more stuff like this on the channel. Two things that I didn't mention that are really cool. One is I missed talking about the VHS tapes that are on Edie's top of Edie's TV. They're from Barbara's show. That's really cool. Also, there's chairs in the trees. There's chairs in the trees when you walk past at night from the storm. They didn't remove them for years because this house is a museum. It's not actually a house. Anyway, thank you for watching. Look forward to more content. I'm very tired though. This was a lot of effort. Biggest project I've ever done. So, love you. Bye. Ah! Oh, God.